Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY, and whether you're new or returning, it's great to have you here, and I hope you enjoy the video. This week I make a hybrid bowl from 5 segmented rings and 3 colour epoxy resin. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first job was to cut the segments for the rings. The saw is set to a 10-degree angle and each ring will have 18 segments. The timber I'm using is Sapele, which has been rough cut to size on the bandsaw and then dimensioned on the jointer thicknesser. After all the segments were cut, I then had to sand the raggy bits off each one. With that done, I could begin the glue up. I applied glue to 6 segments at a time, making sure to get plenty on. After each ring was completed, I used a hose clamp to apply firm, even pressure, and after a quick wipe down, each one was placed to one side and left overnight to cure. Recently I've been cutting the segments on the miter saw, which is giving me really good results, but having to hold the blade down till it stops so I don't get a kickback makes it a long process. So for my next project, I think I'll go back to the table saw. The table saw will speed things up, and if I make a good enough miter sled, the accuracy should still be okay. So let's see what happens. Anyway, back to the task at hand. I won't show all the rings being done, but as each one is assembled, I check for any gaps and make sure the segments line up around the outer circumference. Then I check the level with each other, tapping them into place if not. The next day and the rings have set up nicely. After passing each one through the drum sander half a dozen times on each side, they were ready for the next glue up. 2 rings would form the base and the remaining 3 would be for the upper section and the rim. The 2 rings in the base are both the same size, and just for good measure, I applied glue to both faces. Once they were positioned correctly, I used hot melt glue to hold them in place, then added weight to the top to compress the joint. The remaining 3 rings are each different sizes. These will form the upper section and were glued upside down with the rim at the bottom. Each ring was test fitted, then a pencil line drawn, glue applied, and after each ring was positioned, I used dabs of hot melt glue to hold it all in alignment. Measuring was the best way to centre each ring on top of the next. The size of the rings was made up by myself. I started with a measurement of 32mm on the long side of each segment. This gave me a finished diameter of around 180mm. I made 3 that size. Then I made one with 26mm on the long side, and the rim has segments with 40-ish mm on the long side. I wasn't sure how this would make the bowl look when it was finished, but as you will see, I ended up with something quite nice. the last ring in place, I added weight to compress the joints, and this was also placed to one side and left to cure. It's now just a few hours later, and because of time constraints, I had to get the first epoxy resin pour done. After waxing the bucket, I placed a segmented base inside and used hot melt glue to hold it in the centre. This was a bit of a mistake, but I couldn't think of a better way to do it. After that was done, I mixed a single batch of resin. I'm doing this first pour to fill the centre of the base rings. Once done, it'll be left for a couple of hours before the next and final pour. I decided to do it this way because in my last project with a similar void, I cast the whole thing at once, and this led to some fairly severe cracking in the epoxy resin, which all needed to be repaired, so I'm hoping this will stop it happening again. With both parts added at a 2:1 ratio, I coloured the resin with white mica powder and mixed it thoroughly. Then it was poured into the centre void and left for a couple of hours to begin curing. It's a few more hours later and time for the main casting. For this I mixed 4 batches, 2 with white mica powder, 1 with black mica powder, and the final smaller batch with ingot gold mica powder. Each one was thoroughly mixed and then left to pre-cure before adding them to the casting bucket. Pre-cured the epoxy resin to get better colour separation in the finished piece. In the curing process, the resin heats up and convex. If all the colours are in together from the very beginning, then you can end up with a muddy mess. With all 4 batches added to the bucket, I placed some weight on top of the waste block to stop it floating and put the whole thing in the pressure pot. And with the lid tightly screwed down, I added 50 to 55 psi and left it overnight to cure. It's the next day, and with the casting removed from the pot, on top it looked okay. The colour separation was excellent, the waste block hadn't moved, and there were no visible cracks. Then I tried to get it out the bucket, but try as I might, it wouldn't budge, and eventually I cracked the rim, so I had to cut it free with a Stanley knife. Blank free and the ex-bucket in the recycling bin, I chiselled away the excess waste block, marked the centre and drilled a hole at each end, one for the woodworm screw and one for the tailstock centre. And on to the next stage. After securely fixing the blank to the lathe between the woodworm screw and the tailstock, I could begin getting it roughly to round and balanced. Then I could move on to cutting a mortise in the base. The Woodturning carbide finisher peeled away streams of resin, and very quickly the blank was balanced. patterns left in the resin gave me a great idea for an upcoming project, but that would have to wait for another day. With the tool post repositioned, I set about cutting the mortise. The mortise was cut in the usual way. First I levelled the base using the carbide cutter, then the skew chisel to flatten it off. Next the 1/4" parting tool to define the outer edge and cut the recess to around 8mm deep. A little bit of work from the skew to clean up the resin, then the dovetail cutter to cut the dovetail. And after a final clean up, I did a few decorative rings and it was done. After turning the blank around and refixing it to the forge or chuck, using the tailstock for added security, I could level the top. For this, I used a combination of the 3/8 bowl gouge to remove most of the protruding waste block, then the carbide cutter to get near to a flat surface, and then the skew to flatten it all off. Done, I got on with gluing the upper segmented rings to the resin blank. For this I used a fast cure epoxy resin with white mica powder added. This was thoroughly mixed for a couple of minutes, then liberally applied to the underside of the segmented upper. This was then married to the top of the resin blank, and once in position I added some weight, and it didn't take long for it to take hold. Then I gave it 30 minutes to cure properly. I used what was left to fill the hole for the woodworm screw. This had already started to let go in the previous session, so I hoped this would reinforce it. With the fast cure epoxy fully set, I refixed the bowl to the lathe. I'd overlooked the upper rings in a diameter, so that had to be made larger so the chuck could reach down to the top of the resin. But first I re-drilled the hole for the woodworm screw. The bowl gouge seemed to be a good choice to begin with, but this was threatening a big catch, so I switched to a freshly sharpened side cutting scraper. This was much more controllable, and I soon had enough removed to clear the chuck. So let the turning begin. The blank has been turned around and refixed to the lathe. Using the carbide finisher, I set about rebalancing the workpiece and exposing the segmented rings in the base. To now I'd been a bit concerned the base segments wouldn't be deep enough to form the pedestal and cut through to the underlying resin. But at this point I stopped worrying. It was going to be more than enough to do what I wanted. I continued for a bit more with the carbide, then I switched to the bowl gouge to shear scrape the ribbing to round. Now the blank was in balance, I started to roughly shape the cutout to begin forming the pedestal. With a freshly sharpened gouge, the Sapele cut incredibly well, creating shavings over 6 feet long. To start a cut, I would normally shear scrape the first bit, then continue with a push cut. But with this timber, I could gently offer the open blade up to the edge, scoring an initial line, then allow the bevel to ride into the cut. I was really enjoying this, but I knew I'd have to be careful to not take too much out. Switching over to the spindle gouge with a more swept back grind, I was able to cut deeper, but I still hadn't exposed the resin. So after a bit more shear scraping to shape the upper part of the cutout, I reduced the diameter of the base. This has the effect of making the edge thicker, which allowed me to then take another cut, thinning the base down, but also making it easier to deepen the cutout. Using the bowl gouge, then the spindle gouge, I gradually removed material until I broke through to the resin in the core. Once I'd cut through the resin, I cleaned up as much of the sapele off the surface as I could, but fearing a catch with a spindle gouge, I switched to the mid-size carbide cutter. This did a better job, but it was well over its designed reach distance and it was vibrating quite a lot, so I broke out the parting tool to remove what was left and square up the edges. Right at this point, the battery died in my camera and the MDF around the woodworm screw finally gave way. So after sorting the camera, I turned the bowl around, hopefully for the last time, and continued refining the shape of the cutout, shear scraping with a 1/2 inch bowl gouge. The upper section was next to be shaped. Using the bowl gouge, I thinned the rim down, shear scraping the underside, blending the 3 rings into a series of sweeping curves. For the tighter sections, I used the mid-sized carbide cutter to refine the surface, finishing off with a skew to blend the sapele into the resin midsection. With the outside mostly done, I began hollowing out the inside. The bowl gouge was first to shape the upper section. Using a combination of push cuts and shear scraping, I increased the size of the opening, being very careful around the glue joint between the top and middle segmented rings. The lap between the two was quite tight, and I didn't want to cut it too deep. Next, I had to remove the MDF waste block. I tried the bowl gouge, but this was no good. I couldn't get a good angle, so I used a side cutting scraper. After enlarging the lower part of the segmented rings, I set to cutting out the waste block. This went very quickly, and I was soon through it and onto the lower sapele rings. With most of the weight removed, it was time to cut out the centre support. For this, I used the 1/2 inch bowl gouge, paring it down until it snapped off. With that gone, I adjusted the headstock. By unlocking it, I can swivel it around to gain better access to the inside of the workpiece. So after locking it down at a 45-degree angle, I repositioned the tool post and set to removing material with the full-size carbide cutter. Now I could get better access to undercut the upper segmented rings and thin the side down. For this bowl, I wanted a finished wall thickness of around 10mm or 3/8 of an inch. Once the side was down to the required thickness, I removed what was left of the MDF in the base, levelling it with a sapele. Then I used the large negative rate scraper to finish it off. was the last thing to do. Using the skew chisel, I refined the surface, creating a sweeping curve from the outer edge round and down into the joint with the resin. And after a final pass with a carbide finisher, it was done. Then I sanded both inside and out from 80 to 600 grit, continuing up to 3000 grit just on the resin. Sanding done and the headstock back in its home position, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. Then I applied 2 liberal coats of sanding sealer, each one denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Up next, Yorkshire grit, a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away until no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. This is followed by the resin polishing, beginning with Mirka Polar Shine 10, a single coat, cleaned away, ready for the next stage. Polar Shine 5, another single coat, polished off with more paper towel to leave a deep shine. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax, 2 coats, buffed to seal and protect the surface. And that's it, another project finished, and it's another one I'm very happy with, and I hope you like it too. The 3 colours go well together, contrasting with the Sapele. I especially like the white resin in the base, and the shape, well, that reflects some of my earlier pieces from last year. So with that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, it will be much appreciated. A thumbs up will be great, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.